Today, it's Hebrews 11:27. By faith, Moses leaves Egypt. This week, we're continuing our studies in Hebrews 11, where we're looking at the idea of faith and how the type of faith he is exploring will ensure that the readers of Hebrews persevere in their walk with God against what seems at times the just overwhelming pressures of the world and all its pitfalls. But most importantly, at that time, they're suffering persecution. And some of them are thinking of turning back to going back into the sort of the Jewish rites, the ritualistic practices, rather than actually continuing on with Christ, their Lord. And so we get to this point in Hebrews 11, where he really starts to give us examples of this, but starts off with this very simple outline, which basically covers the whole of the chapter. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. And that's Hebrews 11 verses 1 to 3, and that's taken from the English Standard Version. And as I've repeated week after week to try to really make sure we grasp this, I've said that the writer is asserting that faith is an assured hope in the certain reality of God's salvation plan, and that this kind of faith, driven by assurance and conviction, makes God happy, and so through it we find victory in God's eyes and over the world by faith. He then, in those first 3 verses, offers us a very general application of how by faith we can understand and believe that the universe which we can see was made out of nothing. That's going to be important today. By the very words that God spoke, the unseen makes the seen. And then we said that throughout history and throughout particularly prehistoric times, we've seen through Abel, Enoch and Noah that faith in our God is an ancient doctrine and practice, and that this faith has always led people to walk, worship and serve God. And then we moved forward into the patriarchal age. And we said that through the examples of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, we saw how this same faith was held onto and preserved from birth to death in the lives of men and women in that age, and how no matter what the circumstances, they stood firm on the promises of God and so found victory in God's eyes over the world. And then we saw 2 very ordinary people in Moses' parents who did not fear the pharaohs in their life, whose witness calls us to put our trust in the Father's plan, and by the power of Christ's death and the inner empowering of the Holy Spirit, walk by faith, persevere in what you were called to. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking at these verses, and we've been concentrating on Moses. And you've got the verses there on the screen. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. And then we come to this week's verse. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. And so far, this is where we've been. We started off with verse 24, and we looked at the idea that when he was grown up, he denies everything. When he was all grown up, he denies everything he gained by being the son of Pharaoh's daughter to follow where God might lead him. And then in verse 25, we saw that in doing so, he made the choice to suffer rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin. He chose the eternal promises of God over the temporary pull of the world. And then this was then reinforced by verse 26, which we looked at that last week, by Moses seeing that carrying the reproach of Christ was worth more than anything Egypt had to offer, as the reward was eternal. And so, in summary, so far we've seen the idea that Moses saw no other choice but to stand by faith with his Lord and God, and so he did. And as I said, this is a choice that's going to take him from being a prince of Egypt to a shepherd. Now that's where we're up to. That's where we've got to with our passage. And as I've said, we're doing this in quite a detailed way. Because actually, it's actually quite interesting sometimes to stop and really think about what the words are actually saying, because sometimes we skim over things. And today's verse is one of those verses. Well, if we're not careful, we can miss what's being said, but also by actually examining the text, we can be led to learn more about Moses by actually being forced to go back and look at the passages that the writer to the Hebrews is actually alluding to. And so we're going to do that because, as I've said, it's an interesting verse, this one. I'm going to be using the Berean Standard Bible's version because I think it's the better translation of it. But as you can see, this is our verse today. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. The Amplified Bible says, motivated by faith, he left Egypt behind, being unawed and undismayed by the wrath of the king, for he never flinched but held staunchly to his purpose and endured steadfastly as one who gazed on him who is invisible. Now the Berean Bible says this, by faith Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. The New Living Translation says it was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt. He was not afraid of the king. Moses kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. And then Wuest translates it like this. By faith he abandoned Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he was staunch and steadfast as seeing the invisible one. And Young's literal, which is very, very literal, says this, by faith he left Egypt behind, not having been afraid of the wrath of the king, for as seeing the invisible one, he endured. Now, as I said, this is a bit of a controversial verse, and this has been a really difficult. I was sharing with Mel last night on our nightly walk. This has been a difficult verse to actually do, because depending on how the commentator sees this passage, where it's being taken from, where he's talking about, they tend to sort of speak from that direction. And there are two possible ways of viewing what this verse is talking about or alluding to, especially with the first bit of it. And so there are really big name commentators on both sides of the fence. And there are some that sit right on the middle of the fence. They've got the splinters. Okay? But today I am going to take a side. And you're allowed to disagree with the side I take, because it doesn't affect your salvation. Okay? And we can still get the same message from it. But I think it's worth looking at what the issue is, because it'll take us deeper into the Bible and understand a bit more about Moses' life and see how God's hand was upon his life. So it's really actually very, very important. And also, there's some important words in here that actually lead us to actually know that we must do that. And as I've said, this verse starts with a very, very simple phrase, by faith. Now, this is the principle for which he did what he did. Now, you, if you've been following along with me, will have seen this little statement of what saving faith is on many occasions already. It's quite simple. I've had it on the screen many times. I've read it out many times. And this is what we mean, in a sense, what saving faith does to us. So true faith that saves one's souls includes at least three main elements. It's a firm persuasion or firm conviction. That's summed up in verses 1 to 3. A surrender to that truth. We've got to accept that truth. It's no good just saying, oh, that's nice. We've actually got to accept it. Okay, that's really important. We've got to surrender to that truth. And then there's a conduct that emanates from that surrender. So in sum, faith shows itself genuine by a changed life. And that's really important, because that's what we're seeing Moses go through at this moment. Faith is impacting his life. It is leading him to make decisions, thoughts, actions in his life that are changing his life forever because of what God is doing in his life. He is changing him, he is leading him, he's directing him. And so life is very much changing. He's no longer holding on to some things that were important to him, but he's willing to let go, to stand with God's people. So there's things going on. And so what we must remember when we read this verse, that what he does here is by faith. The writer to the Hebrews is saying this is by faith, no matter what you think about this verse. And so that's really important. And then there's a second phrase in this verse which is quite important, but we're not going to dwell on it, so I'm going to mention it now. And it's a word we mentioned last week. It's an insignificant word, but it has great worth to the reader of this verse. And it's the word for, or gar. You'll see up there I've put the original translation of the Berean Bible uses because. It's actually one of the better ones for how they've placed it, which is why I've chosen this one rather than the word. And you see that I put the word for next to it, the word for or gar. And again, this word is always inserted into the text for a reason. And here he's again, as he did last week, inserting this word to say stop, pause, prepare your hearts. What follows is important. We are meant to stop and think about this verse. We're not meant to just read it and run on. The writer wants us to stop and think. And it would have made them think because they probably would have been poring over the ancient texts of the Bible to try to work out what he was saying with this verse. How can we see that? Can we see that in the passage? And we actually can. And so it's actually really cool. And so by faith is the foundation for our verse, and the for tells us to stop and examine what is written. And that is what we will do today. I know some people always find this a bit overwhelming, but that's what we're going to try to do. I also understand we only have a certain amount of time, so I'll try to get it done. Now let's begin with the issue I mentioned. The issue I mentioned happens at this part of the verse where it says, Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered. This is where the issue is with our passage. And there are a couple of reasons. So what we've got to work out is what's the fuss all about? What is the fuss all about? There's a couple of reasons. The first is this. There are two issues. Can anybody tell me, if I asked you this question, how many times did Moses leave Egypt? Go on, shout it out. Twice, yes. So, Moses left Egypt on 2 occasions. So we start with a question. And a question that comes from this. And there's these are the 2 occasions. First, he fled to Midian after he had killed the Egyptian overseer. So that's Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 to 15. And then he left Egypt with the rest of the Israelites at the Exodus. So Exodus 12, 31 to 42. Those are the 2 times he left Egypt. So the question is, which of these times is he talking about? Does that change anything? Well, to me, it does slightly, only in a very, very tiny way. But it is important to try to get that. And there are big names on both sides of the argument that see it as either being Midian or Egypt. And they make a point of telling you, so it's worth looking, because you may go and read a book tomorrow that tells you the opposite to what I've said. So it's important that we see both sides of the argument. We know it and we're prepared for it, no matter what. But then there's the second issue. And this is the reason why people struggle with when it is he's talking about. This is the key thing. The second issue is the fear mentioned in the dialogue of Exodus 2. Because in our verse, he is said not to have feared the king's anger. So immediately people go, oh, hang on a minute, what's he talking about here? Because there's reasons and ways in which we might see either or of those 2 things being the right way. Now, without those 2 things, there would be little doubt that it was the first leaving of Egypt. It has a flow, you see, the passage. It seems to flow in an order, that little bit. But the difficulty with that is that our writer isn't necessarily writing in a chronological order. So we're going to look at the 2 sides of the argument and then just delve into it, and hopefully we'll understand a bit better why people get into this tangle over this. I'm going to read out the 2 passages to you first from Exodus so that you've got the background to what we're talking about. This is the first one, Exodus 2, 11 to 15. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And then the other passage that involves the leading is Exodus 12:31-39, which reads like this. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people. You and the Israelites go. Worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go. And also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, "We will all die." So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs, wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people and gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. The Egyptians journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. So those are the 2 passages that are sort of key passages to us. There are obviously other places we could look and think about, but these are the important ones in terms of today. So, these are the 2 arguments. Midian. Those who say that it is Midian argue this. They argue firstly, the order of events is critical to the passage. The order is logical. It's there. The Passover is mentioned in verse 28, and that's the next thing. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Therefore, Moses' flight seems to have preceded this event. Point 2 is this. He left Egypt seems a strange way of referring to the exodus of an entire nation. It says he left Egypt, not the people left Egypt. And secondly, they refer back to Exodus chapter 12, verses 31-32. The Exodus was the result of Pharaoh's request. The idea being there was no fear behind it in that sense, because they were asked to go. And in fact, if you read the passage, the Pharaoh goes, "Bless me, please." It seems to be the other way round. So that's where people who argue for Midian, the arguments they have for Midian. Now, those who argue for the Exodus say this: it is hard to reconcile not fearing the king's anger with "then Moses was afraid" in Exodus 2:14. So strong does this appear to some that they call any other point of view special pleading, or, for those of you who aren't in the legal profession, ignoring facts. Okay, it's quite a nice argument. It's a shutting down argument. We'll come back to that in a moment. They also point out that the word for left, katalipen, is best understood of a permanent abandonment. And finally, Moses must have expected Pharaoh would get angry at the Exodus, and he apparently did. So those are the arguments. You might know by the tone of my voice where I'm leaning. You might have guessed, you might not have guessed yet. Let's just pause and consider them. The first one, the order of events. The Passover is mentioned in verse 28, therefore Moses' plight seems to have preceded this event. Now the order would suggest it. It does seem logical. It does, doesn't it? It does seem logical. However, you could see this as an intro to the verses that are following next as well. So you could turn this on its head if you wanted to. The golden rule is that you sort of follow through when you're writing. You go from one event to the next, and normal storytelling is like that. But it could logically be the other way around. It could, if you sat there long enough looking at it. However, he left Egypt seems a strange way of referring to the exodus of an entire nation. Now, it does seem strange to talk of only Moses leaving Egypt, especially in the light of later in the passage. It will talk of the entire people of Israel crossing the Red Sea. It seems quite strange, but is it strange? Should we see it as strange if it's actually the Exodus? Then it is strange, because surely it should have been the whole people that left. The final argument there, the Exodus was the result of Pharaoh's request. It is possible to imagine that Moses supposed that Pharaoh's anger was not far away. It is possible to think that. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not convinced of any of the arguments against Midian. And I'm going to tell you why now, when we go through the arguments for Exodus. This is my personal opinion. You're allowed to disagree. That is always an important part of being a Christian, and discussing and debating these things. It's what we want. But Egypt, it's hard to reconcile not fearing the king's anger with then Moses was afraid. So strong does this appear to some that they call any other view special pleading. Now, as we read Exodus 2, 11 to 15, I want you to note something really quite striking about the passage. Verse 14 reads like this. He answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Verse 14 does not say of whom or what he was afraid. It appears that he was afraid of the fact that he had been found out. That's what that verse seems to imply to me. It also, in verse 15, says that he fled when Pharaoh tried to kill him. And this idea to me, after reading, because I've been reading an awful lot of stuff about the previous verses, about what Moses had done. Moses had made this choice in his life to stand with the people of God. And he was a young prince of Egypt. He was only in his 40s. He was still a little bit... A great example is we've just had this great announcement from Prince Charles that he's going to serve. Now, anyone who's observed Prince Charles over the last 30 years has probably got a little bit of a nudge and a wink on their face, because you know Prince Charles has dibbled and dabbled in politics for most of his life. He has put his oar in lots of places. And Moses was probably a little bit like that as a prince of Egypt. He probably strutted around the place as a prince would. He had a sense of his own importance. He knew that his mother was a powerful woman, and he had the protection of the royal court. And actually, looking back at history, the idea of any prince of Egypt being executed for actually killing an overseer seems a little bit strange. And actually, Moses probably did have options at that point. Even as he was standing there being found out, there were routes open to him that he could have gone down to get a reprieve. He could have thrown himself at the Pharaoh's feet and said, "I'm sorry, my father, forgive me, forgive me." And his mother, standing in the background, might have stepped forward and said, "My lord and king." And we know that she might have done that. She would have stepped forward as a powerful lady and tried to protect her adopted son. There were things open to her. It's his act of defiance that is the issue for Pharaoh. Pharaoh sees the act of defiance. He has decreed that the Israelites should be persecuted. He has made them slaves within the land. They are people who they are not meant to look favourably on. It is not actually the death of the overseer that's the issue. It's the act of defiance that Pharaoh has an issue with. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews has been pointing at in the first few verses of this part of the passage. That what Moses was doing was making a stand with his people. And there are some learning points we can actually see in the text as well, that actually we see God's hand at work with Moses at this point. Firstly, we see Moses encounters the first time that the people behave in an ungrateful attitude towards him. And what does this show us? And what does this show Moses? Well, that shows Moses two things. It shows us two things, and Moses something as well. The people are a pretty ungrateful bunch, and they are not ready yet to be delivered. They certainly are not ready to be delivered by Moses. They're not ready to be led by this young prince of Egypt, just as possibly many of us possibly weren't ready to be led by Prince Charles 30 years ago. Maybe some of us aren't even ready today. We would have loved the Queen to have hung on in there for 5 or 6 more years until she made her 100th birthday and got a telegram from herself. That would have been amazing. That would have been the most amazing picture in the paper. But sadly, it's not to be. God save the King. I say that with all honesty. We note in Exodus chapter 2, God's hand on Moses' life, because he gets a warning. He was probably swanning around the area thinking to himself, look at me, I saved somebody. I helped my people out. And yet in this instance, he discovers, firstly, that the people aren't grateful about it, but secondly, people know about this who he maybe doesn't want to know about it, and this could get back. That would be a worry. Your immediate response when that happens is, when you're found out doing something, sometimes the initial response is fear, but then actually sometimes you man up. You get your act together, that fear dissipates, and you're led into your next thing. So we see that in this instance. We've also seen in this passage Moses behave in a way that was just, because he was just. I mean, many people read this passage about Moses and think, what an awful person he was, he killed somebody. He saw his fellow man being beaten half to death by another man, and he stepped in. That was a just thing that he did, particularly as a man with authority. But it was impetuous. He could have handled it better. And so we see that his sojourn in Midian is something that is going to be useful. He had options. Like I said, he had options. He could have become a rebel leader. Do you know that the actual Pharaoh who might have been on the throne at the time had actually only recently come to power after a massive struggle and was actually not himself an Egyptian, possibly? It could be one of two pharaohs, you see. If it's the one, then he was actually a Semite himself, not from the Jewish line, but from another line. And so there's a possibility here that the Pharaoh himself was sort of led a rebellion, and the Prince of Egypt would have known about this. The Prince of Egypt would have known the history, and he would have thought to himself, right, the Israelites, there's more of them than the Egyptians. Let's raise an army and go and storm the place. But he doesn't. He doesn't take that option up because he was a man of God. God had other plans for his life. And he runs to a place. What's interesting about running to Midian is that running to Midian is actually a place of defiance. Some of us don't understand that. There are many places he could have run to. He could have run to Canaan. He could have run to a number of places, but they had extradition agreements with Egypt. And so if he'd gone to several other places in the surrounding area, he would have been sent back. So where does he go? He goes to Midian because he is going to defy the king. He is not going to be brought back and suffer the anger of the king by doing so. And so by seeing that, we see that this idea of him actually fearing the king's anger becomes less of an issue as we dig into the actual Exodus 2, 11 to 15 story and what was going on, the political situation. And actually, we see God's hand on his life instead. We see this is God taking him out of the situation. And so the first part, I think all the evidence pretty much blows that out of the water. Now, I know some of you are going to come up to me afterwards possibly and say, but you've ignored some facts. Yes, there's a summary in Acts 7 which mentions the fear as being the reason for him going, but Stephen is summarising. He's not doing a blow-by-blow account. He certainly doesn't really encapsulate the whole of this bit. So there's an interesting question to ask about that. The question should be about Stephen's speech rather than maybe about this part being the wrong way around. And some theologians do argue that sort of thing, that we need to look at that and think, what was he doing there? And some say he was summarising. He was very quickly thinking on his feet and summarising. So It's an interesting debate anyway. The second thing here, it says the word for left is best understood of a permanent abandonment. Well, yeah, that's true. However, his second time in Egypt, he's only there for a short time. He hasn't really got time to put down roots, get belongings, and sort of make his mark there, and abandon really anything. Because most of what he loves is in Midian at that point. And actually the Hebrew word that's used in Exodus chapter 2 actually gives the same sort of sense, this idea of leaving quickly and getting out of there, and pretty much just, it's the idea of bolting. You see, when you bolt from somewhere, you leave everything where it is and you get out of there now. And that's what he did in our passage in Exodus 2. In Exodus 12, it was a much longer process. They had time to gather belongings, take things. There was no abandonment. So that mitigates against the Exodus being the thing. And then finally, he must have expected Pharaoh would get angry at the Exodus, and he apparently did. Well, that's a little bit sort of jumping ahead, because at the moment they leave Egypt, the Pharaoh actually looks like he's happy to see the back of them. I'm happy to see the back of you guys. Please get out of here, and please ask your God to bless me, because I'm going to be honest with you about this. You guys scare the life out of me. My son has just died at your hands. I don't want you guys around. I don't want anything worse than what's just happened to happen to me or my people. So please get out of here now. So you can probably see that I've argued for Midian. I've argued for it. And some of the commentaries I've read this week have actually said that personally, overall, it does seem best to take the words as referring to the flight to Midian. Now, at this point, I'll mention a few names just so I put a little seed of doubt in your mind. But Calvin, MacArthur, some big names there, they disagree with me. That is not intentional. I quite like both of them. Normally, I'm quoting them in my sermons. So it's a big thing for me to step back from them. But there are other guys like Fawcett and other guys who go the other direction. Stedman, other people who believe that it's the Midian one. But do you know what? At the end of the day, whichever situation is the correct one, what we are meant to learn from the opening part of our verse is that by faith, as it did for Moses' parents, counters the fears we have of those who might seek to persecute or prosecute us for our faith. We are able to stand firm on our convictions. So as Ryrie says, whether it is Midian or the Exodus, this is what we are called to learn, and that doesn't change whichever way you take it. However, for the flow of my sermon, I am going to be quoting Midian when I mention where he goes from, because that's the one I've decided to follow. Because otherwise I'm just going to be saying Midian or Exodus every 5 seconds, and that really is very difficult, and you do get splinters from doing things like that. But this is the important part. Faith counters the fears we have of those who might seek to persecute or prosecute us for our faith. We are able to stand firm on our convictions. And he does endure. The word katurio means to be strong, to be steadfast, to continue in a state without wavering. And in a sense, whatever he did here, he did it knowing that God was in charge of his life, and he did it without wavering. And if it is Midian, we know he did it without wavering because he stayed there for 40 years. You can't waver when God takes you somewhere and puts you into the desert for that long. You've got to be steadfast. And so even in this moment of Moses' life, when his entire world was seemingly being blown apart by death threats and the need to leave everything he knew, by faith he stood strong. That's what we see in this. Now we go on to the next part of our passage, which is the bit that our writer wants us to really take a moment to dwell on, to think about. The author, by way of reason for everything that I've just said, gives us a paradox. He saw him who is invisible. He saw him who is invisible. I see you, my Lord. If I was standing in front of a room of non-Christians at this moment and I said that statement, I see you, my Lord, they would all think I was a nutter. Some people do think that. They talk about skyfarers. I've mentioned that before. Many people in the Telegraph comments section, whenever God's brought up, they talk about, oh, so you believe in skyfarers, do you? No, I believe in my Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, and everything that goes along with that. Now, we know this about Moses. We know that throughout Moses' life, he did have a close relationship with God. In fact, it says this in Exodus 33:11. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks with his friend. Although, do remember that these face-to-face conversations, God would speak to him from within the cloud. So there was, because God says in another place, you know, you will die if you see my face. But he says, it talks about this idea that Moses speaks to God face to face as a man speaks with his friend. This also nods to me towards the Midian adventure, because if it was the Midian adventure, we have no record of such intimate, talking directly, contact until Exodus 3, which is 40 years away. And so Moses, up to this burning bush, has very much had the similar type of relationship that we have with God. We see the invisible, but he's not necessarily visible, if you know what I mean. Our writer tells us that he saw him who is invisible. The writer is clearly outlining that Moses' faith was the same faith that each of us has. Moses' faith was not reliant on the burning bush, as amazing as that was. Moses' faith did not depend on seeing God's back, as totally mind-numbingly awesome as that would be. No, it was because he saw him who is invisible, which should be and is the normal state of every believer. We all see him, don't we? We all see him who is invisible. We see him. Sometimes it's when we look back. Sometimes it's when we hear the call. Sometimes it's when we open our Bibles. We see him who is the invisible. Through spiritual eyes, Moses, he did, and we see God. Through spiritual eyes. That's what this is saying. He saw him who is invisible. He saw the invisible hand of God upon his life, leading him, taking him. Very similar to what many of the patriarchs, what Abel and all the other guys saw. They saw the invisible hand of God. They saw him. They saw him through those spiritual eyes. That moment when we're in the midst of the storm and we feel some strange reason, the peace that is beyond all understanding overwhelming us. And we go, yes, Lord, I know you are with us. I've said many times the story our sister Karen, who's not here today, often tells us about when she, according to the doctor, she should have been dead. And they told her that in the hospital, and she said, no, God's with me. She knew God was with her through all the pain she had suffered to end up in that situation in hospital, being told this information by the doctor. She knew God was with her. Every time someone said to her, don't worry, the ambulance is on the way, she would come back with, don't worry, God's with me. The invisible hand of God. We see him. We see him in our lives. And that is what he's talking about. And that's the call of the verses that we're looking at. Remember, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendations. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made of things that are visible. And he says that, but then he reinforces it after this chapter by saying this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Looking to Jesus. Can you see Jesus here today? Yes, we can through spiritual eyes. He is seated at the right hand of God, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, he is here with us worshipping today. Remember I spoke about this when I spoke about the reproach of God. I spoke about how even when we're suffering, Jesus is there with us, suffering along with us too. When Jesus is blessed through us, he is also blessed at the same time, because he is present with us through this supernatural spiritual presence that we talk about. We are a supernatural religion, an Eastern religion. Romans 1:20 says this, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." If we can't see Jesus, if we can't see these invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, we have no excuse, because they've been visible to us. Can be clearly perceived, and by Christians they are. We sing songs that are all about what we see through our spiritual outlook as Christians. And so we see that. And even more so, we are blessed by this invisible seeing, by this ability to see that. We are blessed by it. John 20:29 says this, Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." The writer to the Hebrews is reinforcing the blessed nature of this beatitude that Jesus tells us in the Bible, that Jesus actually says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And in this moment, in our passage in Hebrews today, Moses is blessed indeed because he sees the power of the invisible one at work in his life, and he obeys. He goes where God takes him. Yes, he gets there in a way that for many of us may have seemed really, really difficult, but he gets there because of the hand of God upon his life, and he perseveres. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews is trying to say. He's trying to say to him, you see, through these spiritual eyes, we have the victory. Seeing Jesus through that spiritual outlook is what makes God happy. We have the victory because we see Jesus even though he is not physically standing next to me. What an amazing blessing Jesus said that is. Through the power of the Holy Spirit, our eyes are opened to Jesus. It is awesome. And so as Moses discovers that the Pharaoh wants to kill him, as he realizes he must go, leave all that he knows, all that is familiar, he sees the invisible hand of God upon his life. He obeys God and sets off to begin a 40-year sojourn in Midian. Remember, a sojourn is being an alien in a strange land. He's never to settle there, not to settle there really, because God's in charge of his life. One day he's going to leave there. It was not because of fear of Pharaoh he did this, but because God was in charge of his life. That's what our writer wants you to see. So he went even though he knew this would make Pharaoh furious. And Moses is commended for this by faith. He goes where God wants him to be and makes God happy. That is what our passage is about today. And so in summary, Hebrews 11:27 gives us some very simple lessons. And some of you are going to say, why didn't you just skip to this, Tony? It would have been quicker. Okay. It's this: faith, an assured hope and a firm conviction in what we do not see. Christ often puts us into opposition with powerful forces. Faith, an assured hope and a firm conviction in what we do not see. Christ enables us to obey God without fear. And then finally, faith, an assured hope and a firm conviction in what we do not see. Christ overcomes powerful opposition by seeing the unseen God. And so by faith, we can overcome. That is simply what this verse is about. And yes, I've told you today there are commentaries that get tangled up in the first bit, and it's actually quite useful to have a quick look at that. And hopefully you've learned something new about those passages through it. But this is what the writer to the Hebrews wants to get at, because he is talking to a group of people who are struggling. They are finding it hard. They need this at this time, this reassurance that what they see is real. What they do not see is real. That paradox. And by faith, they can overcome no matter what. Philippians 4:6-7 says this: "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Fix your eyes upon Jesus. Fix your eyes upon the maker and creator of this universe, the saviour of your souls. Fix your eyes upon him in every situation. Fix your eyes upon him. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And then you will be able to escape from the enclosure like the African impala. Mel loves me bringing this in. I think she's going to be out 1 week because she's going to decide that it's shouldn't be there. But the African impala can jump to a height of over 10 feet and cover a distance of greater than 30 feet. Yet these magnificent creatures can be kept in an enclosure in any zoo with a 3-foot wall. Because they can't see over the wall, they don't think they can do it. We see what's beyond the wall, even though we can't see it, don't we? The animals will not jump if they cannot see where their feet will fall. Faith is the ability to trust what we cannot see. And with faith, we are freed from the flimsy enclosures of life that only fear allows to entrap us. Allow God to lead you, even though things may look difficult, and overcome by faith, as Moses did, by trusting the unseen.